Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 235, Jews and Whiteness. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Roseberg.
And as we continue this series exploring American Jews and American Judaism and race, we have talked over the past few weeks with a number of folks from organizations that are created by and for Jews of color, as well as folks who are working in organizations focused on social justice and some of the important repair work going on in terms of race in America and the role of Jews in that. And related to that, our guest today is somebody who's going to help us understand a bit of the context, a bit of the history in which Jews of European descent became seen in America as white, sometimes comfortably so, sometimes uncomfortably so, both in terms of their own self-conception and the conception of others. And we really want to dive in and understand this and understand its consequences. So we are excited to welcome today our guest, Eric Goldstein. He is the Judith London Evans Director of the Tam Institute for Jewish Studies at Emory University, where he is also Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies. Eric Goldstein is the author of a book called The Price of Whiteness, Jews, Race, and American Identity, which was published in 2006 by Princeton University Press. In addition, he is the author with Deborah R. Weiner of On Middle Ground, A History of the Jews of Baltimore, published in 2018 by Johns Hopkins University Press. He is a former editor of the quarterly scholarly journal, American Jewish History. Eric Goldstein, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Recently, we've been talking about this question of, race being the original sin of America, being so fundamental to what America was built upon. And I'm wondering how the Jews enter into that picture. When they arrive in America, or when various waves arrive in America, how are they seen racially? How do they see themselves racially? Or is that not really something that's on their mind at that time?
For the most part, in the colonial and early national period, there's really not much discussion of Jews being anything other than white. And matter of fact, I think in my own teaching, for example, that's not a period that I research in heavily, but in my own teaching, when I teach American Jewish history, I've really recently been thinking about the necessity to go back and frame that period more in terms of race, because the colonial period and the beginning of the 19th century is often seen as a time of Jewish integration and really, in terms of modern Jewish history, a really new and exceptional period, compared to what was going on in Europe at the time, in terms of Jews having unprecedented freedoms and attaining a legal integration. There was a whole age of emancipation beginning in Europe and going on to the mid-19th century. And the small community of Jews in the American colonies and the early republic really achieved emancipation almost automatically, without any debate or discussion about the status of Jews. So they were really accepted in the language of the US Constitution. They were considered free white persons, which was kind of the key legal terminology that marked someone as part of the white population that had access to those rights.
I've originally trained as a lawyer, and I remember there being Supreme Court cases, I think relatively early, although I can't quite remember, that referred to the Jewish race and that referred to others, I believe, Arabs and others as a race. And so I'm wondering, when did that language come into the picture? And when various developments in America talk about the Jewish race, do they mean that in the same valence as the African American or the Black race? Or are they using race in two different ways?
Right. Well, what I notice is in the 18th century, you see the word nation a lot, applied to Jews, but the racial terminology really reached a high point in the 19th century. And it was partly because there was a lot of racial language in Europe that was tied to the rise of European nationalism. And different European groups, as part of their nationalist vision, understood themselves in racial terms as well. What you get in the United States is different definitions of race kind of both competing with each other, but also overlapping and intermingling with each other. So part of the reason that race becomes an issue for Jews is that you have, on the one hand, this one kind of racial map of Anglo-Saxons and Teutons and Celts and so on. And then you have the idea of race based on color, which arises from the colonial system. And I would say for much of the 19th century, Jews were able to be understood as a race, as quote unquote members of the Hebrew race, without necessarily that challenging the notion that they were white. And that's true for other European groups as well. And all of these groups, although sometimes it could be used in a negative sense, and anti-Semites could use the language of race against Jews, but also Jews use this language themselves in a very positive way to sing their own praises, to talk about their attributes, to talk about what they saw as the unique qualities and talents of their group. And it was particularly useful for Jews at a time when Jews were integrating and assimilating into the broader culture. And they may not have been religious anymore. They may not have been maintaining the traditional markers of Jewish identity, and yet they still very much felt tied to the Jewish community. And so race was a way of describing what they considered a kind of intangible attachment to the Jewish group without describing any particular behavior.
Well, I think in this conversation, I suspect we're going to be jumping backward and forward in time. To put it in some context, I'm thinking a little bit about contemporary, or perhaps not exactly contemporary, but in our lifetimes, where this conversation has been. Because I remember very distinctly as a younger person, let's say in the 80s, there was some feeling, a strong feeling. I'm trying to think, where did I pick this up? But there was a strong feeling that when you're filling out a demographic survey as a Jew, you shouldn't check white. That was not what we are. And I remember distinctly, in this period of time, checking off other and writing Jewish. And now I kind of feel like anytime I fill out a survey, I always check off white. And that's not out of a sense of pride. That's out of a sense of well, really, that's what I am in America. I mean, that's the honest truth. It's how I'm seen in America. And yet, of course, that's not true of white supremacists and how they see me. And so it's this very confused situation. And today, when some of these debates are happening, I think it becomes very generationally confused and problematic where, somebody's parents or grandparents may saying, we're not white, and then some young person is saying, but we have white privilege. And it becomes this trucking at cross purposes. And there's a lot of fighting among, let's say, white-skinned Jews with their grandparents about this subject. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you sort this question out about whether, and again, just to be clear, we're talking about Jews who, at least in some places in America, read as white-skinned. Those Jews at this point was what we're talking about, and saying, well, how do we kind of sort through the complexity of this question? Are Jews who basically have white skin, are they white in America today?
Right. That's a great question. And government classification and classification on different forms and things is a really great microcosm, a window into this larger issue, because it's a moment in which the person filling out the form is confronted with the need to define themselves in a way in which they have limited options. And so it's really a great window. And that's something that I looked at in my own work. Really, for much of the 19th century, Jews could define themselves as a race and be seen as a race without that particularly threatening their status as whites and their right to claim all of the rights that quote unquote free white people in the United States had access to. And I see that really changing toward the end of the 19th century, and that had to do with two simultaneous processes. One is the Jewish population was changing. It was the beginning of a mass migration from Eastern Europe. As late as the 1880s, there were only about 150 to 250,000 Jews in the entire country. And between 1880 and 1924, over 2 million Jews arrived mostly from Eastern Europe. And so, and also they're very concentrated in the larger cities. By World War I, Jews were 1/4, 25% of the population of New York City. So they're a very small population overall, but they're very visible. And it's also a time of great social and economic change in America with industrialization, urbanization. And so the United States is facing a lot of challenges that shake the confidence of the native-born white population. And so it pushes them to begin to look at difference and look for scapegoats and for some of their problems, and to think also about the cohesiveness of their population. So all these things are happening at once. And so this becomes a more, you could say, dangerous time or fraught time for Jews in terms of how to define themselves, how they fit in. And one of the ways that the white native-born population responded to these challenges was by ideas of racial hierarchy. So this is a time when Jim Crow laws are being enacted in the South, and in the scientific community, ideas of race are being elaborated and refined, and this idea of hierarchy and order that pervades the society in general is really causing more debate, more exactitude in terms of studying and elaborating theories of race. So this is a fraught period for Jews, for European Jews, because it's becoming more possible, or at least they fear, that race could be used in insidious ways against them. And one of the fears is that they could begin to be defined in a way that differentiates them from the larger white population in ways that group them with people of color. And that had never been a really major concern before. So I think that starts happening in the 1890s and early 1900s. And then it's really only after World War II that process begins to recede. In the period from the 1890s through World War II, Jews were very nervous about being different and about how race might be used against them. As they integrate into white America in the period after World War II, their concerns changes to ultimately, it doesn't happen all at once, but ultimately by the period that Dan is talking about, in the late 70s, 80s, they become much more concerned about how they can assert their difference and how they can prevent European descent Jews from being kind of homogenized and lost in the larger white population.
I want to try and distill some of these beautiful sort of historical lines you're talking about. And this is like a dangerous thing to do, right? But I want to find some like stories and people specifically from some of these eras to talk about, because I think that helps so many of us gain a broader sense of what you're talking about. And you also have just a rich diversity of different kinds of voices and contexts in your book. And I kind of want to open the floor to you, but I mean, to look back at that early period, I mean, I think you did such a beautiful job of looking at interesting figures I had like heard of before and I knew a little bit about, but you really you looked at people like Felix Adler, who is known as starting like the Society for Ethical Culture, which I had sort of known as a general fact, but I didn't know like what level of controversial that was and how ideological different people's approach to the idea of Society for Ethical Culture was. You talked about people like Isaac Mayer Wise and Kaufman Kohler, who are seen as these radical reformers, but actually they were deeply particularistic around the issue of intermarriage. And you talked about women and gender and how that and how questions of race, Jews, and whiteness play out differently there. And so I'd love to just try and add some specificity to this through stories. And to the extent you feel able to do this, are there a particular couple people or groups or moments that you could identify as like, this really opens up a window into something about race, religion, whiteness, ethnicity, all these words we're using that can help us understand them better?
Felix Adler was a universalist. He was the son of a Reform rabbi, and he kind of took some of the ideas of universalism that grew out of Reform ideology and took them to kind of their next level, in which he said, well, if really ethical monotheism, one of the core ideas of Reform Judaism was that ethical monotheism, the kind of ethical and moral aspects of Judaism were really the most important aspects instead of the ritual and national elements of Judaism. If that was really the most important, why does Judaism need to retain its separateness as a religion at all? Why not have a kind of universal notion of humanism, ethics, just based on those ethical and moral principles that could bind all people together? And most Jews were not willing to accept that. Most Jews, even those who stressed these liberal ideas, at heart, they were still tied to a notion of Jewish peoplehood and Jewish difference. But it's interesting. It raises a question that Jews were often attracted as a group that was upwardly mobile, that wanted to integrate into the larger society. They were often attracted to universalistic ideas. My doctoral advisor, Todd Endelman, an emeritus professor at the University of Michigan, was fond of saying universalism is the greatest Jewish particularism. Ironically, Jews are more interested in more the people who suggest ideas of universalism than the general society, because they have more to gain from it. They're more invested in the idea of universal ideas. And so it's interesting to look at someone like Adler, who was very idealistic. This was a kind of world-changing idea that his motivation was, to create a world without boundaries and to create a world where everyone could come together and to break down boundaries of race and difference and religious hatred and so on. Even in the 20th century, a lot of Jews tended to favor kind of classical liberal visions of society. And this caused problems later on because it didn't take into account ideas such as structural racism. This is where you see a lot of clashes, I think, between the Jewish view of the world in the 20th century and early 21st century, and say the African, not that there's one view, but the way that many African Americans experienced the world, and that these ideas that these differences could so easily be overcome and pushed aside, and that there could be a kind of colorblind and a society blind to difference. That was something that seemed more attainable from a Jewish standpoint than from, say, an African American standpoint or the standpoint of a person of color. Because they were looking at it from their own perspective, it sometimes blinded them to the challenges and the problems faced by other groups and groups that were very important and very defining for American society.
I think Lex is going into history, and I'm obsessed with today. I'm thinking about, and probably it's your students at college, that where it feels like it's offensive to young Jews to attempt to hear white Jews attempt to evade their whiteness, to say we're not white, and can you talk a little bit about that, and to the extent, I guess, like, my question is whether in the language of American race today, it's really quite true that when we're talking about white people, then white-skinned Jews are included in that group, and therefore, that what's really at stake, I think, in those conversations is an attempt to evade the fact that you have white privilege. It's not necessarily saying something, I think, it's not necessarily saying something about like, well, you should understand yourself in this deep way to be part of this race. It's just saying that the contemporary issue that we have today about race is more about whether you have the privilege of, for example, not being likely to be stopped and killed by the police, or you don't have that privilege. And really, that's the salient question. And in that definition of it, white Jews are white.
I have to say that my own thinking has evolved a little bit on that issue, because the current situation has really caused me to see the importance of really talking about the way in which contemporary Jews benefit from white privilege. Traditionally, my book, part of the idea of the book was, while I certainly did recognize the advantages in the way in which Jews benefited from white privilege, I also wanted to question the stability of the black-white dichotomy. In other words, there's a way in which the idea that all America is divided into the categories of black and white is itself an ideological construct that was, part of white supremacy, and it served certain psychological and political goals of kind of stabilizing white power and easing concerns about social and cultural change by trying to make the world exist in very clear hierarchical categories. And what I tried to show is that Jews had always disturbed those categories and been a subject of debate and discussion, but also they face a lot of pressure to change the way that they define themselves and to change their behavior to fit into those categories so that they would not be so troubled. And that's what I meant by the price of whiteness. Not that I absolutely was not saying that Jews had suffered in any way comparable to African Americans, but what I wanted to say was that Jewish identity to some extent had to be sacrificed in the service of both integration that Jews wanted to achieve, but also in the service of the larger national culture, which demanded that these two categories be the supreme categories of American life. But I think that, particularly in the late 20th and 21st century, it's undeniable that European descent Jews absolutely benefit from white privilege. And not only that, but you really have to look at their unprecedented degree of integration into the central institutions of American society. And when you consider the fact that Jews are, overrepresented in higher education, in government service, in the financial sector, in popular institutions of popular culture, so many aspects of American society, it's impossible to say that they are somehow separated from or not implicated in the way in which whiteness and white privilege inform all of those core institutions of American life. Now, saying that doesn't mean that they still don't have a complicated relationship to whiteness. And of course, there's anti-Semitism, right? So there are still ways today in which Jews can be victimized. But I think the problem is kind of making clumsy comparisons between, say, Jews and African Americans and other people of color.
Can we talk a little bit about white supremacy? Because that feels like the other side of the coin, and the way in which it's actually right of Jews, or most of the time European descended Jews, to say, but the people who really want to be white, the people who really think that whiteness is something important and makes you superior, they don't include us. Can you help us grapple with it? I mean, how would you imagine would be a good way to be talking about these concepts today?
It really has to be a balancing act. I think that on the one hand, Jews, because of their position as a group that has experienced different sides of this phenomenon, and they do have a history of persecution and anti-Semitism, they are very well positioned to be people who can help lead conversations about the ways in which American society needs to change and understanding the implications of racism and privilege and things like that. They have a certain perspective on the issue, which is different than that of many other white groups. And I'm talking about European descent Jews here. But at the same time, there's also a danger in focusing too much on Jews' sense of difference and history of persecution as a way of obscuring white privilege and the way that it acts. And I think so there has to be a conversation, in which Jews can try to leverage their history, but not in ways that obscure the degree to which they've benefited from white privilege over the decades. This is a period in which it's no longer attractive and helpful to fit in. There's ways in which they want to distance themselves from the larger society. So this is precisely at the time when the temptation is to fall back on this idea that Jews are different, Jews have this history of persecution, and to kind of flatten out the ways in which their experience was different from African Americans. So I think it really requires some careful and focused conversation within the Jewish community. And the final thing that makes it really hard is that in this moment, there are also incidents of anti-Semitism, which are unprecedented in American society. And that makes it even harder for Jews to understand that they can at once be, victimized by some of these attacks and shootings, but at the same time, in the larger society, they are not subject to a lot of the structural, to really hardly any of the structural disadvantages in terms of economics, politics, and society that people of color face.
I want to look at the mid-20th century a little bit because for a few reasons. One, I think that that's an era that when conversations of Jews and whiteness come up, a lot of people talk about, whether it's, people like Abraham Joshua Heschel, involvement of Jews in civil rights solidarity work. But I have a couple recent learnings that are coming to mind. One is from another scholar of Jewish studies. We have a great bonus episode of Judaism Unbound where we talk with Beth Wenger. It's only like 10 minutes for those who want to listen, about a series of advertisements for Levy's Jewish Rye in the mid 20th century, which were very famous at the time. Some people listening, if you maybe you remember these, and they're interesting because they feature people of color, and the tagline is "You don't have to be Jewish to like Levy's Jewish Rye or to eat Levy's Jewish Rye," and they are just taking for granted that if you see somebody who's black, one of the most famous ones is a black child, obviously in quotes, they're not Jewish, such that you can then make the argument you don't have to be Jewish to eat Levy's Jewish Rye. And they have a famous one with a Native American person. They have a number of these advertisements. And the other, to play the balancing act for a second, the other side of that is that I recently watched a movie that I thought was really fascinating. I was stunned that I had never heard about it before, called The Angel Levine, in which there is Harry Belafonte, famous guy, like big person, plays a black and Jewish angel, and has this fascinating set of interactions with this white Jewish guy who lives in New York City. And that came out in 1970. So there was clearly a claim being made there that like, you don't have to be white to be Jewish, to sort of parallel that Levy's Jewish Rye claim. So I guess in that spirit of keeping everything complicated in all the most gloriously hard ways, help us relate to the mid 20th century along the axes of questions of whiteness, of Jews. I know that your book in many ways sort of, it goes mostly up to, 1950? But I'd love for your help.
Right. So what you're pointing to is the way in which Jews often turn to images of African Americans in their popular cultural excursions as a kind of tool in doing that balancing act. On the one hand, asserting themselves as part of the larger white population, but also making some gestures toward difference and separateness. And what happened is often African Americans and images of African Americans ended up being kind of proxies that helped Jews express certain feelings toward distinctiveness, but in a way that was also safe, that simultaneously presented them as white people, because in contrast to African Americans, they appeared as white. So you see this in The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson in 1927, where he's a blackface performer, and there are some interesting scenes where it's when he actually has blackface on that he's able to get in touch with his own Jewish feelings of difference. But then, of course, he puts it away and is an assimilated part of the white population. And so there are these ways in which Jews of that period, especially the 20s, 30s, 40s, could make these excursions into Black culture, which kind of the Jewish involvement in jazz, jazz and the music industry is another example of this, where there was a kind of sense of a special connection, and then it filled it was a way of expressing their difference through an interest in Black culture, but it was also one from which they could safely retreat back into the precincts of the white population. And that also, I think, worked on a political level in terms of Jewish civil rights activism, for example, or what I call racial liberalism, which is that Jews were the large number of Jews who supported that political stance, it was a way for them to both, on the one hand, be part of a white political world and be part of the political mainstream, but adopt a position that was still within the spectrum of acceptable white positions, but one that got them as far away from kind of white supremacy and assertive racism as possible. And so it kind of soothed their need to say, well, we're not like a lot of these other white people, but it still placed them kind of within the political white mainstream. I'd like to just say a few words about Jews of color, because I think that's an issue that's becoming an increasing point of discussion in the Jewish community today. And I think it kind of brings us to a new place in this, historical development. And it brings the discussion of race and difference to a place within the Jewish community, whereas typically this has been a discussion about how the Jewish community navigated its relationship to the larger white world. And now this is in an interesting way, these discussions are happening within the Jewish community about whiteness and the connection of whiteness to Jewishness. I think it also provides an opportunity to begin to redefine the very nature of Jewishness in the United States. And here I think we also have to be careful, because I think the temptation today among, it's funny because we mentioned earlier about how many young Jews who are socially active and socially aware increasingly feel the need to kind of claim white privilege and to acknowledge white privilege. But there's also a contrary tendency, which is that many Jews who are kind of disgusted by white racism want to feel that they can show solidarity with people of color by also saying, well, we aren't white, we're part of the, and of course the danger of that is it kind of obscures the way in which Jews have benefited from white privilege. So I think all those issues that potentially discussions and working through issues of being more aware and of these things through conversations around Jews of color can be a very helpful avenue to bring some of these issues to the fore. Also, in my work, at the end, I made the statement that ultimately I think Jews of all backgrounds can have a kind of more vibrant Jewish identity if Jewishness can eventually be disentangled from whiteness. That the larger framework of whiteness and the black-white dichotomy in the United States has put Jewishness in a very precarious situation in which Jewish difference had to be downplayed, and Jews were put in a very precarious relationship to their own past. And I think in a way, to the extent that the Jewish community is becoming more diverse, and that can be a step toward disentangling the relationship between Jewishness and whiteness. The word of caution that I would say is that, again, I think we can't, that's not a leap that we can take too quickly, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And that's part of a larger societal transformation and dismantling the larger structures of white racism in America. And it's not just a matter of Jews saying, okay, we're now going to ally with people of color. Those European descent Jews who feel passionately about these issues, that history and that consciousness has to be used as a jumping off point to begin to participate in the long, slow process of dismantling structural racism in America. And that may take decades and lifetimes, but not to use that history and that consciousness as a way of kind of just saying, as a Jew, I'm not white and I'm separate from that history and that culture.
I'm curious about so you just talked about how the Jewish population is becoming more racially diverse. And I guess the question I have is, in what ways does that, in a sense, retroactively change what Jewish history is, or at the very least, what parts of history, when we look back on it, we as Jews talk about? So what I mean by that is, let's say hypothetically, and I don't know that this is going to be anywhere close to true. It might be, but let's say in 100 or 200 years, most American Jews, or most Jews globally, are Jews of color. If we were then talking about American life in the 1800s, wouldn't we almost automatically talk as much about slavery? I mean, let's say if there were a bigger portion of black Jews specifically. All of a sudden, even if most black Americans who were enslaved in the 1800s weren't Jews, there's a sense in which that becomes part of the Jewish story if people today those are their ancestors, right? If I were in a Hebrew school classroom, a religious school, Sunday school classroom, and we did, an ancestry exercise and people came to class and talked about their family stories, and multiple people in that class had stories that were not tracing to Europe at all, that were tracing to other places, and that may trace to American slavery, that becomes part of our curriculum in a sense, even if it wasn't Jews. But I also could hear somebody arguing that well, it's still not Jewish history in the same way because they weren't Jews at the time. How should we wrestle with that? And is there a way in which it's not only that history is in the past and, I don't know, sociology or demography is in the present, but that who is Jewish today can actually have an effect on what the history is when we look back on it?
That's a fascinating question. First of all, it's not just Jews of color that will, create that effect, but there are, if around half at least of Jews, who marry today are marrying people from outside the Jewish community of all backgrounds, it's also true of people with Irish ancestry and French ancestry, so
right.
The Jewish population is becoming more diverse in all ways, not just people of color are one aspect of that. Key here is the difference between history and memory. The whole interesting contradiction of the idea of identity is that notions of identity present a stable and linear past, specifically as a way of obscuring what was actually a very, very windy and unstable past. And so, for example, to some extent, the Jewish world has always been diverse, and there are ways in which there were different populations that were not considered part of the Jewish mainstream in different times and locations. So in the 1880s and 90s, when East European Jews were streaming into America, the German Jewish establishment was referring to them in the press as wild Asiatics and miserable darkened Hebrews, and wondering, quote, if they were of one race with us or not. And, so these are maybe not exactly the same situations as we have today, but it shows that, Jews have changed the way they have understood themselves and redefined their history and what the Jewish collective was many times in the past. And our story of our origins and of our ancestry today is not the same story that people told 200 years ago or 1,000 years ago. And so it's almost certain that there will be a different story that's told in 100 years due to changes that are going on, all kinds of changes that are going on now.
So I have two questions relating to the interaction between European descended Jews and African Americans, and they're two time periods. I mean, one is that basically the period of slavery. I remember meeting, this is many, many, many years ago, I remember meeting an African American friend for the first time who was definitely not Jewish and had a very Jewish, a stereotypically Jewish name. And I said to her, well, how did you get your name? How did you know how your family got your name? And she said, well, I don't really know, but I assume slavery. And that was the first time that it, really hit me. I hadn't grown up in this country for a lot of my youth. That wow, there were Jews that owned slaves. It just didn't occur to me. So I'm curious about that period of Jews and race. And also then on the flip side is this time where the Jews happily go around saying how involved we were in the civil rights movement. And, I grew up, again, with the complimentary assumption that all the Jews were major leaders in the civil rights movement. Of course, that's not true. There were some. But the question there, too, for me, in the context of this conversation, is what was the orientation of the Jews who were involved in the civil rights movement towards race at that time? Did they see themselves as white people who were allies of with African Americans in the struggle for equal rights? Did they see themselves as often also a kind of different race because it was relatively soon after the Holocaust and they were struggling with that? Or was there some way in which the relationship of race to European descended Jews during the Civil Rights Movement was a particularly unique manifestation?
There certainly were Jews who were slave owners, going back to the 17th and 18th century, where there were Jewish merchants who participated in overseas trade, and in the Caribbean, for example. Later in the United States, of course, particularly in the South, insofar as they were a well-integrated part of the white population. And because slavery was an integral part of the economic and social landscape, particularly in the American South, they were inevitably involved in slavery in different ways. But because Jews had a different socioeconomic profile than the society at large, they were involved in it to differing degrees and in different ways. So, for example, Jews were, although there were some exceptions, Jews typically were not, say, owners of plantations or involved in agricultural work. So they probably tended to own slaves on a much smaller basis, or they lived in urban areas mostly. So they may have had a few slaves who worked in their households or something like that. And now, going to the second part of the question about the Jewish role in the civil rights movement, this is again where history is different than memory. And I think, there's a way in which the position that Jews are in today, these descendants of European Jewish immigrants, there's very much a tendency today to want to play up Jewish difference and the way in which Jews were a minority, and there's much more of a tendency to point to similarities and relationships and between Jews and African Americans today. That would have been totally different before World War II, where it may have happened occasionally, but when Jews were in the position of wanting to integrate into white society, they were very often trying to put distance between themselves and African Americans. So you have to understand the kind of attractiveness of pointing to civil rights activism as a symbol of Jewish identity today, as in some ways having more to do with the psychological and emotional needs of contemporary Jews than it has to do with an actual accurate historical portrait of Jewish participation in the movement. Today, Abraham Joshua Heschel is pointed to as an exemplar of Jewish values and the way that Jews related to the civil rights movement. Locally here in Atlanta, there was a Rabbi Jacob Rothschild, who was the rabbi of the temple, which was bombed in 1958 by white supremacists. And I would say, he is also lauded in a similar way as a kind of symbol of Jewish values and Jewish identity. But the truth is that in their own times, both of those men were often vilified by their own communities, or many people in their congregations and their communities had grave doubts about their activism and how they felt it might endanger the Jewish community. On the one hand, Jews were disproportionately involved in civil rights causes when you look at the white population as a whole. But on the other hand, nothing approaching a majority of Jews were involved in the civil rights movement, that very particular types of Jews tended to be involved. And here I go back to one of the key points of my book, which is that Jewishness, being of Jewish origin, did not have one predictable outcome in terms of the positions that one took vis-a-vis African Americans and civil rights. That being of Jewish background could, on the one hand, create a sense of empathy and identification with African Americans, but it could that feeling of difference and fear of being marked as different in American society could also push Jews to distance themselves from African Americans and take part in types of American racism. But within the Jewish community, there was still a great diversity and sometimes, very contradictory positions where you may vote for candidates who promoted a broad, liberal platform, and Jews were interested in liberalism for reasons that also benefited the integration of the Jewish community. But those candidates also promoted civil rights, and there was seen as a kind of commonality of interest there. But those very same people could be concerned about, say, neighborhood change. So there were a lot of contradictory positions.
So we need to arc to the close. Thank you for all of this, but I have one closing question. First off, one little statement that influenced me. I heard from Larry Rubin, who was a white Jew who, like many white Jews, went down south in the 60s and was part of a lot of civil rights work at that time. And I heard him as part of a tour of multiple such folks, wandering around and giving beautiful testimonials about their experiences. He told this story multiple times, and each time it just really hit me. And so I wanted to share it, which is he went to a synagogue shortly after he got, I think it was to Georgia actually, since he lived there, but somewhere in the South. And he wanted to go to a Shabbat service, see what it's like. He's this northern guy, 20 years old, whatever. And he walks in and, he's stopped at the door, or shortly after he explains who he is and why he's in Georgia. A man says, we don't want you here. And the guy's name, I'll never forget it, is Stonewall Cohen. He tells it like that. He's like, the guy's name was Stonewall Cohen, which, for anybody who's listening in other countries, maybe doesn't know as much American history. Stonewall Jackson is one of the preeminent, Confederate generals. To have a Jew named after Stonewall Jackson with the last name Cohen, of all things, Kohen, priest, in Jewish history and memory, it brings up all the contradictions, all the questions, all the balancing acts that we need to be doing. So I wanted to just sort of invoke that. And the closing question I have really is, okay, so you're pushing us in this episode to hold complexity and to do this balancing act that we need to do to better understand our Jewish past, both, the sides that we can most empathize with and be proud of, and the sides that we're less proud of. What do we do with this? As a closing, to somebody who is listening to this in the context of other episodes we've had recently with organizations spotlighting Jews of color, to somebody who just is thinking as an American person, what do they do to be a part of, movements for racial justice today? What would you like to see people do with the historical knowledge that you bring to light in your book? With the obvious caveat that I know it's not always a scholar's job to prescribe actions in the world, but to the extent you feel comfortable with it, what should people take your work to be sort of a premise for and then act from in the world?
Right. First of all, I just want to say that the first thing I'm going to do after this interview is go look up Stonewall Cohen, because I have to know more about that. To answer your question, I think the danger is to think that there's some easy fix that we can all go out and do something easy and quick that's going to fix the situation. I think what I hope this scholarship contributes to is just a greater consciousness of a complicated history and the way in which the Jewish story in America hasn't just been the kind of easy success story that it's often told as, about America being a land of freedom and tolerance and Jews found unlimited opportunity here, but that American history has always been shaped and framed by issues of racial inequality, and that those have actually made the Jewish relationship to American identity and the process of Jewish integration a very fraught and complicated one, and painful in many ways, and one that exacted many costs in terms of expressing a vibrant Jewish identity. And so in that sense, I hope that it pushes Jews to have more awareness about the larger structures of racism in the United States, and to try to understand their complicated place within that history, and not fall back on some of the kind of common myths and stories narratives that Jews tell themselves. To the extent that an awareness of that history can propel activism or action, I think, and I would say this to all people who are, anxious to kind of help reshape the society, that it's a very slow and painful and difficult process. It's one that I think for people who do benefit from white privilege, it's a very painful process, and to some extent a process that will require those people not always feeling that they're in a safe place. It requires going out on a limb. And I think that's what European descent Jews have to do in terms of re-examining their history, is to question some of the received narratives and to confront some of the maybe more painful aspects of the Jewish integration into the United States. But in terms of achieving change, I think Jews, as I said, are well positioned because they are in so many major institutions, and they do hold positions of power. So I think that they're in a good position to be able to affect change and to initiate processes of reconsideration and reflection, and that will eventually lead to the restructuring of society. But I think we all have to understand that that's a very slow process, and that if we try to make it into a quick overnight process, it will actually result in not achieving the kind of very major and deep work that needs to be done.
Thank you so much, Eric Goldstein, for joining us. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. Thanks for bringing this context.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We want to close out this episode in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound, or our other one, Jewish Live, all one word. Second, you can head to our Twitter feed, which is @Judaism Unbound. Third, you can check out our Instagram, also Judaism Unbound. And fourth, our website, JudaismUnbound.com. Last but not least, you can always hit us up via email at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. We also want to make a plug that, guess what? The high holidays are almost here. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are almost here. I know it's a little more than a month, but we want to name it now because Elul, the final month before those holidays, is really, really close. And we have our Elul Unbound initiative that we launch every year, and we hope that you'll participate in it. You can do so if you head to JudaismUnbound.com/Elul. You can sign up for our email list that's part of Elul Unbound. You can check out all the different content that we're going to be launching and see what we've done in past years. Head there, JudaismUnbound.com/Elul. We hope that you will join this interesting, awesome journey. So the last request we like to make is that we really do appreciate any amount of financial donation that you can send our way, and you can do that via JudaismUnbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift. So thank you so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.